When the Union Army seized control of Davidson County in February 1862, they requisitioned dozens of abandoned properties for military use. Most had been left in disarray, furniture overturned, documents burned, valuables hastily removed by fleeing Confederate sympathizers. The process was routine. Soldiers would sweep through empty estates, catalog remaining assets, and convert suitable structures into barracks, hospitals, or supply depots. But the Harwell estate, 17 miles southeast of Nashville along the Cumberland River Valley, presented something different. The three-story manor stood untouched, as if its occupants had simply vanished mid-routine. Breakfast plates remained on the dining table, food long since rotted. A leather journal lay open on the study desk. Ink dried in the middle of an unfinished sentence. Clothing hung in wardrobes. Books lined library shelves. A grandfather clock in the entrance hall had stopped at 3:47, its pendulum silent. Captain William Morrison of the 3rd Ohio Infantry was among the first to enter the property. His initial report, preserved in National Archives records, described the scene as peculiarly undisturbed, as if the residents departed with intention to return momentarily. He noted the quality of furnishings, the extensive library of agricultural and scientific texts, and what he termed an atmosphere of abandonment that exceeded typical wartime evacuation. For 3 days, Morrison's company used the manor as temporary headquarters while scouting surrounding territory. Soldiers slept in the bedrooms, cooked in the kitchen, used the study for planning sessions. It was only on the 4th day, February 19, 1862, that Private James Ketchum, foraging in the root cellar for preserved foods, noticed something unusual. The cellar was large, approximately 40 feet by 30 feet, with stone walls and a packed earth floor. Along the walls sat rows of storage shelves holding empty canning jars, broken pottery and burlap sacks. Ketchum was moving these sacks, hoping to find potatoes or turnips beneath them, when he discovered that the floor in one corner sounded hollow when struck. He called for assistance. 2 other soldiers helped him clear the area, removing sacks and debris. Beneath, they found a wooden hatch, approximately 3 feet square, with an iron ring handle. The hatch was secured by a heavy, sliding bolt, rusted but intact. Ketchum pulled the bolt free and lifted the hatch. The smell that emerged made all 3 men recoil, a fetid combination of human waste, decay, and stale air that had been trapped underground for months. Ketchum dropped the hatch and retreated, gagging. One of the other soldiers vomited. Captain Morrison was summoned. When he arrived, he ordered lamps brought and peered down through the opened hatch. A wooden ladder descended into darkness. He called down. Silence answered. Morrison ordered Private Ketchum to descend. The young soldier, visibly reluctant, climbed down with a lamp, while Morrison and 3 others watched from above. What Ketchum found in that underground darkness would haunt him for the rest of his life. His testimony, given to a military investigator 6 days later, describes entering a chamber carved from bedrock, approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. The air was thick and foul. His lamp illuminated crude sleeping pallets along the walls, waste buckets in one corner, and an overturned water barrel. And then he saw the children, 8 of them, huddled in the far corner of the chamber, filthy and skeletal, shielding their eyes from the lamplight. They were dressed in rags. Their hair was matted. Their skin showed lesions and infections. Some had visible injuries, broken bones healed incorrectly, scars from untreated wounds. When Ketchum called out to them, none responded. They simply stared, faces blank, eyes reflecting lamplight like animals in a cave. I thought at first they might be dead, Ketchum testified, animated corpses of some kind. They did not move except to shrink from the light. They made no sound. One of the older girls was rocking back and forth, her mouth moving but producing no words. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was scratching at the wall with his fingernails over and over in a repetitive motion that seemed to have no purpose. Ketchum climbed back up the ladder and reported what he had found. Morrison descended personally to verify. When he emerged 15 minutes later, his face was ashen. "Get the surgeon," he ordered. Immediately. It took 3 hours to coax the children out of the underground chambers. They were terrified of the soldiers, terrified of the light, seemingly unable to comprehend that they were being rescued. When the surgeon, Dr. Albert Hayes, finally examined them in the Manners parlor, he found conditions that defied his medical experience. His report, written February 21st, 1862, and later submitted to the Provost Marshal's office in Nashville, documented 8 children between apparent ages of 12 and 16, though their actual ages, he noted, might be younger given their stunted growth. All exhibited severe malnutrition with body weights 40 to 60% below expected norms, rickets from vitamin D deficiency due to lack of sunlight exposure, skin conditions including dermatitis, fungal infections, and discoloration, dental decay and gum disease, multiple untreated injuries, some recent, others older and poorly healed, respiratory infections from prolonged exposure to damp conditions, severe PS, ecological trauma including mutism, catatonia, and dissociative behaviors. 2 of the children could not walk without assistance. 3 could not speak coherently. All exhibited what Dr. Hayes termed extreme fear responses to basic environmental stimuli. Flinching at loud sounds, cowering from sudden movements, refusing to make eye contact. But it was Dr. Hayes's examination of the underground chambers themselves that revealed the full horror. In addition to the main room, Hayes discovered 3 adjoining chambers connected by narrow passages. One contained 12 sleeping pallets, crude constructions of wood and straw, arranged in rows. A second contained sanitation facilities, buckets, a drain hole, and what appeared to be an attempt at a primitive washing station. The third was the most disturbing. A small room, barely 8 feet square, containing a chair, a desk, and observation slits cut into the wall at eye level, allowing someone in that room to watch the main chamber without being seen. On the desk, Hayes found a leather-bound journal. Inside were dated entries, meticulously written, documenting what the author called the Controlled Development Protocol. The entries began February 12, 1856. Hayes also found 2 bodies. They were in the sleeping quarters chamber, laid out on pallets, covered with thin blankets. Both were children, or had been. Decomposition was advanced but not complete, suggesting death had occurred within the past 3 months. Hayes could not determine cause of death through field examination, but noted evidence of prolonged illness and physical deterioration consistent with the conditions observed in survivors. Captain Morrison immediately ordered a full investigation. He assigned guards to the property. He secured all documents found in the manor, including multiple journals, ledgers, and correspondence. He had the 8 surviving children transported to a contraband camp established for formerly enslaved people, liberated by Union forces, where Dr. Hayes continued their medical treatment. And he sent an urgent dispatch to his commanding officer in Nashville, describing what had been discovered and requesting instructions. What followed was a military investigation, testimony from witnesses, examination of documentary evidence, and ultimately a decision by federal authorities to suppress almost all information about the case. The official record mentions only irregularities in the management of enslaved persons at a plantation property in Davidson County. The investigation file was sealed and classified. Officers who participated were instructed not to discuss their findings. The detailed medical reports, witness testimonies, and documentary evidence were collected, archived, and forgotten. But the truth, pieced together from fragments that survived the suppression, a few preserved letters, marginal notes in official documents, one partial medical report rediscovered decades later, and testimony given by elderly veterans in the 1890s, reveals something that authorities in 1862 deemed too horrific for public knowledge. This is that truth. This is what happened at the Harwell estate between February 1856 and November 1861. This is the story of Edmund Harwell, a man who believed he was conducting scientific research, And this is the story of 12 children who suffered in darkness so profound that some never truly emerged from it, even after rescue. Edmund Harwell was not born evil. Understanding what he became requires understanding what he was. A dangerous combination of intelligence, ambition, and a complete absence of empathy that manifested slowly over years. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1814, Edmund was the only child of Marcus Harwell, a schoolmaster who operated a small private academy for the children of merchants and minor professionals. Marcus was a rigid, cold man who valued intellectual achievement above all else. He taught his son Greek and Latin before age 8, mathematics and philosophy before 10. Affection was expressed through academic approval. Failure was met with disappointment so profound that young Edmund learned to fear it more than physical punishment. Edmund's mother, Sarah, died when he was 6 years old. Marcus never remarried, never spoke of her, removed all her possessions from their home as if erasing her existence. Edmund learned that loss was something to be managed through emotional detachment, that sentiment was weakness. By age 14, Edmund had surpassed most of his father's other students. Marcus began preparing him for university, drilling him in sciences and natural philosophy. But there was something concerning in the boy's intellectual development, a fascination not with knowledge for its own sake, but with knowledge as a tool for control. When Edmund was 15, Marcus discovered that his son had been conducting experiments on stray animals. Not crude torture, but methodical studies of behavior modification through environmental manipulation and reward-punishment conditioning. Edmund had filled 3 notebooks with observations about how cats and dogs could be trained to perform specific actions through controlled stimuli. Marcus's response was revealing. He did not punish Edmund. Instead, he engaged him in discussion about scientific methodology, about the importance of careful documentation, about how to conduct research without attracting negative attention from people who wouldn't understand the value of objective inquiry. This was Edmund's true education. Not that his experiments were wrong, but that they needed to be conducted with discretion. At 17, Edmund enrolled at East Tennessee University, later renamed the University of Tennessee, to study agricultural science. The field was experiencing rapid development in the 1830s. Scientific farming was replacing traditional methods. Planters who adopted modern techniques, crop rotation, soil chemistry, selective breeding, achieved dramatically higher yields than their neighbors. Edmund excelled. He absorbed everything: botany, chemistry, engineering, animal husbandry. But his professors noted something unusual in his approach. While other students were interested in understanding natural processes, Edmund was interested exclusively in controlling them. His thesis paper, submitted in 1836, was titled "Environmental Determinism in Agricultural Production: Eliminating Variable Factors to Maximize Yield Optimization." The paper was technically brilliant. It was also, several professors noted privately, disturbingly cold in its reduction of all living systems, plants, animals, and by implication humans, to input-output mechanisms that could be engineered for efficiency. Edmund graduated with honors. He was 22 years old, academically accomplished, and socially inept. He had few friends. He showed little interest in typical young male pursuits: drinking, gambling, courtship. His passion was optimization, methodology, control, and he needed resources to pursue his interests. In 1841, Edmund met Louisa Kenton at a social function in Knoxville. She was 20 years old, the only daughter of Charles Kenton, a tobacco merchant whose business was failing due to a combination of poor investments and declining health. Kenton owned a 600-acre property in Davidson County, purchased years earlier when tobacco prices were high, now mortgaged and barely productive. Edmund recognized opportunity. He courted Louisa with methodical precision, not with passion, but with carefully calculated demonstrations of stability and competence. He spoke about agricultural science, about modern farming methods, about potential returns on properly managed land. He was, in effect, selling himself as a business proposition. Louisa was intelligent but naive, educated in music and literature, but sheltered from commercial realities. She saw in Edmund a serious, accomplished man who seemed capable of providing security in uncertain times. She accepted his proposal after a 4-month courtship. They married in March 1842. Charles Kenton, relieved to have his daughter settled and desperate for financial assistance, transferred ownership of the Davidson County property to Edmund as part of Louisa's dowry, along with the existing mortgage debt and all assets, including 43 enslaved workers. Edmund was now a plantation master. He was 28 years old, and he finally had the resources to implement his theories. The property he inherited was in poor condition. The previous owner, Kenton's business partner who had managed the plantation before his death in 1840, had been incompetent. Fields were exhausted from years of growing the same crops without rotation. Equipment was broken. Buildings were deteriorating. The enslaved workforce, poorly fed and overworked, was demoralized and unhealthy. Edmund saw not a disaster but a controlled experiment. Here was a system in complete disarray, perfect for testing his optimization theories. He began with meticulous documentation. He created a ledger system that tracked every aspect of the operation. Crop varieties planted in each field, weather conditions, soil composition, fertilizer applications, yield per acre. He catalogued equipment and created maintenance schedules. He inventoried every asset down to the last nail. And he began documenting the enslaved workforce with the same meticulous detail he applied to crops and equipment. In 1842, most plantation owners viewed their enslaved workforce as general labor, interchangeable units to be assigned tasks based on immediate need. Edmund considered this approach wastefully inefficient. He created individual files for each of the 43 people he now legally owned. Each file contained physical characteristics, height, weight, estimated age, notable features, health assessment, chronic conditions, injuries, physical capabilities, skills, inventory, prior experience, demonstrated aptitudes, learning capacity, behavioral observations, temperament, cooperativeness, relationships with others, productivity metrics, work output, quality of work, consistency. He spent 3 months conducting what he called initial assessment and categorization. He observed people working, interviewed them, though calling these one-sided interrogations interviews is generous, tested their abilities with different tasks, and documented everything. Then he implemented his system. He divided the workforce into specialized groups, field workers further subdivided by crop type, skilled craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers, domestic staff, animal handlers, maintenance workers. He assigned each person to tasks that matched their documented capabilities, but he went further. He implemented what he called a performance-based resource allocation protocol, essentially a merit system where workers who exceeded productivity targets received marginally better conditions, slightly more food, slightly less brutal working hours, occasional small privileges like Sunday afternoons for rest. This was not kindness. It was behavioral engineering. Edmund had studied animal training techniques and understood that reward-based conditioning was often more effective than punishment-based systems. He designed his plantation operations around this principle. The results, from a purely economic standpoint, were remarkable. Within 2 years, crop yields increased by 40%. Equipment maintenance improved, reducing breakdown costs. The workforce, responding to the incentive structure, became more productive and showed fewer disciplinary problems. Neighboring planters noticed. By 1845, Edmund's reputation as an innovative agricultural manager was spreading through Davidson County. He was invited to speak at regional agricultural societies. He published articles in farming journals. Letters arrived from plantation owners asking for consulting advice. Edmund's social status rose. The awkward, cold academic became a respected expert. Louisa, meanwhile, managed the household and social obligations, hosting dinners for neighbors, maintaining correspondence with family, fulfilling the role of plantation mistress with competent grace if not enthusiasm. Their marriage was not affectionate, but functional. They occupied separate bedrooms. They conversed about household management and social obligations, but rarely about personal matters. Louisa knew her husband was unusual, distant, obsessively focused on his work, showing more emotion about crop yields than about human relationships. But she accepted this. Marriage for people of their class was an economic and social arrangement, not necessarily a romantic one. What Louisa did not fully understand, because Edmund carefully concealed it, was that her husband viewed everything and everyone around him as components in systems to be optimized, including her, including the people they enslaved. And increasingly, his interest was turning toward a question that would eventually lead to horror. Could human behavior itself be optimized through environmental engineering starting from childhood? In 1847, Edmund attended a regional agricultural conference in Nashville, where he heard a presentation by a professor from the University of Virginia about breeding livestock for specific traits. The professor discussed how environmental conditions during early development could influence adult characteristics, how horses raised in specific training environments developed different temperaments and capabilities than those raised without structured conditioning. Edmund became fixated on this idea. If animal behavior could be shaped through developmental environment control, why not human behavior? He began researching everything he could find about child development, education theory, and what was then called mental philosophy. He corresponded with academics, purchased books on pedagogy and psychology, read controversial European theories about environmental determinism, and he began observing the children on his plantation with a new interest. By 1848, there were 19 children under age 12 among the enslaved population. Some born on the property, others acquired when Edmund purchased additional workers to expand operations. These children lived in the quarters with adult family members, helped with age-appropriate tasks, and generally grew up within the traditional structure of enslaved community life. Edmund saw wasted potential. These children, he believed, were being raised in what he termed chaotic developmental environments that would produce suboptimal adult workers. Their skills and behaviors were formed randomly through imitation and unstructured experience rather than through systematic conditioning. What if, he wondered, children could be raised in carefully controlled environments, with every aspect of their development managed to produce specific outcomes? What if you could engineer workers who were not only physically capable, but psychologically optimized for obedience, productivity, and specialized skills? He began drafting plans for what he called a juvenile training facility. In 1849, he converted an unused storage building into dormitory space for children. He announced to the enslaved community that children over age 6 would be separated from families for educational purposes and skills training, presenting this as a progressive measure that would prepare them for more valuable work roles. The reaction was predictable horror. Parents pleaded to keep their children. They were refused. Edmund had legal authority to do whatever he wished with his property, including separating families. 17 children were moved into the new dormitory in May 1849. Edmund hired, through intermediaries to avoid revealing his true intentions, a tutor from Knoxville, a young man named William Crane, who needed money and was willing to teach enslaved children basic literacy and mathematics without asking too many questions about the overall program. Edmund established rigid schedules. Wake at dawn, morning exercises, basic education, skill training in specialized tasks, afternoon physical labor appropriate to their ages, evening meal, then what Edmund called socialization period, before bed. To outsiders who heard about this arrangement, it seemed potentially enlightened. A plantation owner investing in workforce development through education and training. Some neighboring planters even praised Edmund's forward-thinking approach, but the reality was something else entirely. The education wasn't meant to enlighten these children, It was meant to condition them. The socialization periods were observation sessions where Edmund watched how children interacted, documenting their behaviors, testing different group dynamics to see what produced the most compliant results. He kept meticulous notes on each child: how they responded to authority, how they performed under pressure, which incentives motivated them, which punishments modified their behavior most effectively. He was treating them as laboratory subjects, running experiments on developing minds, and he was learning. Over 3 years, Edmund refined his understanding of how children could be conditioned, shaped, controlled. He became convinced that traditional child-rearing was fundamentally inefficient, that optimal human development required scientific management. By 1852, he had developed a comprehensive theory. He believed that human behavioral plasticity was greatest during childhood, that this period represented a unique opportunity for engineering specific traits, and that traditional developmental environments introduced too many confounding variables: parental influence, peer interactions, uncontrolled experiences that corrupted the conditioning process. What was needed, he concluded, was environmental purity, total control, complete elimination of random influences. He began designing a more radical experiment, an experiment that would require complete isolation, an experiment that would need to be hidden from everyone, even from people on his own plantation who might object or report what they witnessed. An experiment underground. In early 1853, Edmund began planning construction of what he described in his journals as the optimal developmental environment, a space where children could be raised under conditions of complete environmental control. He spent months considering the design requirements. The space needed to be isolated, completely separate from external influences, hidden from casual observation. Controlled. Every environmental factor, light, temperature, sound, had to be manageable, sustainable, capable of maintaining subjects for extended periods with minimal intervention. Observable, allowing him to monitor and document without constant direct interaction. His solution was subterranean construction. Underground chambers would provide natural temperature stability, complete isolation from external light and sound, and perfect concealment if properly disguised. In May 1853, Edmund commissioned what he described to workers as an underground cold storage expansion for the existing root cellar. He hired a mason from Murfreesboro who specialized in bedrock excavation for basement construction, a taciturn man who did quality work and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Edmund supervised personally, but revealed minimal information. He claimed the expansion was for storing increased crop yields, that he wanted sophisticated cold storage to improve food preservation. The mason had no reason to question this. Wealthy planters often invested in elaborate property improvements. The work took 7 months. Slaves from the plantation performed the heavy labor, excavating rock, hauling debris, mixing mortar, but they worked in rotating shifts, ensuring no single person understood the full scope of the project. Edmund carefully managed information flow, showing workers only the specific tasks they needed to perform without revealing the overall design. By December 1853, the construction was complete. Beneath the existing root cellar, accessible through a concealed hatch that Edmund had the carpenter install and camouflage, lay a network of chambers carved 15 feet into Tennessee bedrock. The main chamber, 20 feet by 30 feet, 8-foot ceiling. This would be the primary living space. Edmund installed oil lamps in fixed ceiling mounts, with control ropes extending up through concealed channels to the root cellar above, allowing him to control lighting without entering the space. He created a ventilation system, narrow shafts drilled at angles through the rock, emerging in wooded areas 50 yards from the manor where they would go unnoticed. The shafts were too small for anyone to climb through, but adequate for air circulation. The sleeping chamber, connected to the main room by a low passage, 15 feet by 20 feet. Edmund had sleeping pallets constructed, 12 of them arranged in rows. Each was a simple wooden frame with a straw-stuffed mattress. He installed storage shelves for clothing and personal items. The sanitation chamber. A small room 10 feet square, containing wooden buckets for waste, a drain hole that emptied into a naturally occurring underground crevice, and a washing station with a water barrel. The design was crude but functional, based on prison architecture Edmund had researched. The observation station. This was the most revealing design element. A small room, 8 feet square, accessible only from the root cellar above through a separate passage. The room connected to the main chamber via narrow observation slits cut at eye level. Someone sitting in this room could watch the main chamber while remaining completely hidden and silent. Edmund furnished the chambers with basic necessities: wooden stools, a central table, a cabinet for storage, buckets, ropes, and basic tools. He installed a pulley system for lowering supplies, a rope and basket mechanism that allowed him to deliver food and water without entering the space. He also installed a speaking tube, a pipe system connecting the observation station to the main chamber, allowing him to address subjects without being seen. The entire design reflected Edmund's core philosophy: total environmental control. Every element was engineered to give him maximum authority over the subject's experience while minimizing their ability to influence their own conditions. In January 1854, the chambers were complete. Edmund furnished them with books he had carefully selected, religious texts emphasizing obedience and acceptance of one's station, basic educational materials, nothing that might encourage independent thinking or questioning of authority. And then he waited. The chambers sat empty for 2 years. During this time, Edmund continued running the plantation, managing the children's training program, and planning the next phase. He was waiting for the right subjects. He was waiting for conditions that would allow him to proceed without too much risk of discovery or interference. And he was waiting for the psychological state that would allow him to actually implement what he had planned. That state arrived in March 1855 when Louisa died. Louisa Harwell went into labor on March 8, 1855. It was her first pregnancy. She was 34 years old, not dangerously old by the standards of the time, but not young either. The pregnancy had been difficult. Louisa had suffered from persistent illness, fatigue, and swelling. Dr. Nathan Pierce, the nearest physician, attended the birth at the Harwell Manor. Labor began in the evening and continued through the night. By morning, it was clear something was wrong. The child was malpositioned. Louisa was weakening. Dr. Pierce attempted forceps delivery, a dangerous procedure even in skilled hands. The child, a boy, was delivered stillborn at 11:40 a.m. on March 9th. Louisa, hemorrhaging and exhausted, died approximately 2 hours later. Edmund's response to this double tragedy was not conventional grief. Several people who saw him during the days following, Dr. Pierce, neighbors who paid condolence calls, the minister who conducted funeral services, noted his unusual affect. He showed no tears. His voice remained steady. He spoke about the deaths in clinical language as if discussing crop failures. "It is regrettable," he told one neighbor, "that medical science has not advanced sufficiently to prevent such outcomes. Perhaps in time, with proper research and methodology, such losses will become preventable." Dr. Pierce found Edmund's coldness disturbing, but attributed it to shock. The minister suggested Edmund might be suppressing grief through stoic resolve. Neighbors whispered that he had always been strange, and this tragedy had simply revealed his true nature. None of them understood what was actually happening. Edmund's detachment wasn't grief suppression, it was his natural state. He had never loved Louisa, not in any conventional sense. She had been a functional component of his life system, and now that component had failed. He felt not sadness, but irritation at the disruption to his ordered existence. But Louisa's death did trigger something significant: philosophical radicalization. In the weeks after the funeral, Edmund retreated into his study with his journals and books. He began writing extensively about determinism, control, and human development. His entries from this period show a mind tipping from methodical coldness into something more actively dangerous. "Nature is chaos," he wrote on March 24, 1855. "Birth, death, disease, all random, wasteful, inefficient. But human intelligence can impose order. We need not accept natural outcomes when we can engineer better ones. The farmer who allows crops to grow wild is a fool. The planter who allows workforce development to occur randomly is similarly foolish. And the man who accepts that human potential is fixed by chance factors rather than amenable to systematic optimization is denying the core premise of scientific progress." He began corresponding with practitioners of discredited pseudoscientific disciplines, phrenologists who claimed skull measurements could predict behavior, early practitioners of what would later become psychology who were experimenting with controversial methods. He read everything he could find about sensory deprivation, isolation studies, environmental conditioning. By autumn 1855, Edmund had convinced himself of several dangerous propositions. 1. Human behavior and capability were almost entirely products of environmental conditioning during childhood developmental periods. 2. Traditional child-rearing environments were chaotic and suboptimal, introducing random variables that prevented proper development. 3. Optimal human development required environmental purity, total control of all influences on the developing mind. Such optimization was not just possible, but morally justifiable as advancement of scientific knowledge. He began planning to activate the underground chambers he had constructed 2 years earlier. He would need subjects, and he would need a selection methodology. Between October and December 1855, Edmund spent weeks observing the children on his plantation. He attended their training sessions. He watched them during work periods. He reviewed his extensive files documenting their characteristics and behaviors. He was looking for specific criteria. His journals from this period list his selection requirements. Age, 6 to 10 years old. Young enough to be maximally susceptible to conditioning, but old enough to survive without constant care that would require excessive intervention. Physical condition. Generally healthy, free from obvious disabilities or chronic illnesses that might compromise the experiment or require medical treatment he couldn't easily provide. Psychological profile. Tractable temperament. Demonstrated capacity to follow instructions, not prone to extreme emotional reactions that might destabilize group dynamics. Social isolation. This was the most revealing criterion. Edmund specifically wanted children with minimal attachment to adult family members. Those who had been separated from parents through sale, orphans, or children from families Edmund had deliberately fragmented over the years. This last criterion reveals Edmund's awareness that what he planned would be easier if there were fewer people likely to persistently question where the children had gone. By January 1856, he had identified his subjects. Group 1. The recently acquired 3 boys and 2 girls from groups purchased within the past year, separated from their parents during sales in Virginia and Kentucky. These children had arrived at the plantation already traumatized by sale and separation. They had no family connections on the property. Their absence might be noticed, but there would be no one with the emotional investment to persistently demand answers. Group 2. The orphaned. A brother and sister ages 8 and 6, whose mother had died from fever in August 1854. Their father, a field worker named Samuel, was assigned to the farthest fields and saw his children infrequently under Edmund's deliberate work scheduling. The children had been living in the communal children's dormitory for over a year. Group 3, the communally raised, 4 children born on the estate but raised according to Edmund's collective child-rearing protocol that he had implemented in 1849. These children had been separated from birth mothers at young ages and raised in group environments with minimal individual parental contact. Edmund had designed this system partly for efficiency, but also, as his journals reveal, as an early conditioning experiment. Group 4. The deliberately isolated. One girl, age 9, whose family Edmund had sold to a plantation in northern Mississippi in September 1855. He had orchestrated this sale specifically to create an isolated child for his selection pool. The girl's name was Dinah, and she had been living in the children's dormitory since her family's departure, confused and grieving. 12 children in total. Edmund assigned them numbers in his journals, Subject 1 through Subject 12, depersonalizing them as laboratory specimens. On February 10, 1856, Edmund made final preparations. He stocked the underground chambers with supplies: dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, water barrels. He placed the selected books on shelves. He tested the lighting system, the pulley mechanism, the ventilation. Everything was ready. Edmund began early. At sunrise on February 12, 1856, he went to the children's dormitory and informed William Crane, the tutor, that he was transferring 12 students to a new specialized training program in a separate facility, and that Crane would be working only with the remaining children. Crane, who had learned over years of employment not to question Edmund's decisions, simply nodded and asked no follow-up questions. Edmund then addressed the 12 selected children, telling them to collect their personal belongings. They would be moving to new quarters where they would receive advanced instruction and important training. The children obeyed because they had no choice. Some looked frightened, others seemed hopeful. Perhaps new quarters would be better than the crowded dormitory. Edmund's tone was calm and authoritative, giving no indication that anything unusual was happening. He led them across the plantation grounds in early morning light, a line of children following a master who owned them legally and completely. Any enslaved adults who saw this procession knew better than to ask questions. Such movements and decisions were entirely within Edmund's authority. They arrived at the manor. Edmund led them to the root cellar entrance. Several children hesitated. The cellar was dark and unfamiliar. Edmund assured them in measured tones that this was simply the entrance to their new quarters, that they should proceed down the stairs. They descended into the root cellar. Edmund lit several lanterns illuminating the space. He walked to the corner where the concealed hatch was located and pulled back the burlap sacks covering it. "Your new quarters are below," he said. "Climb down carefully." He opened the hatch. Lamplight fell down the shaft, illuminating the wooden ladder. The children stared down into darkness with obvious fear. Edmund selected the oldest boy, Subject 1, age 10, a child named Marcus, who had been on the plantation for 8 months, and ordered him to descend first. Marcus hesitated. Edmund's voice hardened. "You will obey immediately, or you will be severely punished. Descend now." Marcus climbed down. Edmund ordered the others to follow one by one, some crying, some silent, all terrified but unable to refuse. Edmund descended with them, carrying a lamp. For the next 2 hours, Edmund showed them the underground chambers. He demonstrated the sleeping area, explaining that each child had an assigned pallet. He showed them the sanitation chamber, explaining the procedures they must follow for cleanliness. He demonstrated the pulley system, showing where food and water would be delivered. He showed them the books and explained that they would have education time each day. He established rules in clear, authoritative language. Wake when he called down each morning. Follow the daily schedule he would establish. Maintain cleanliness and order in the chambers. Obey all instructions immediately and completely. Cooperate with each other. Fighting would be punished. Never touch the ladder or attempt to reach the hatch. Never make excessive noise that might carry through the ventilation shafts. He spoke as if this were ordinary, as if living underground in darkness was a normal part of training and education. Some children cried. Edmund ignored this. He finished his orientation, climbed back up the ladder, and emerged into the root cellar. He looked down at 12 faces looking up from the darkness. Frightened, confused, uncomprehending. "Your first meal will be delivered this evening," he said. "Use this time to settle into your quarters and review the reading materials provided. I will speak with you again tomorrow morning." Then he closed the hatch and secured the bolt. The sound of that bolt sliding into place, a heavy metallic scrape followed by finality, was the last sound those children heard from the outside world for hours. Edmund climbed the cellar stairs, returned to the main house, and went to his study. He opened his journal to a fresh page and wrote the date, February 12th, 1856. Below it he wrote, "The Controlled Development Protocol, Day 1. Then he began documenting his observations, writing in precise clinical language about subject responses to initial environment introduction and baseline behavioral metrics for comparison with post-conditioning assessment. He showed no awareness that he had just committed an act of profound evil. In his mind, he had simply begun an important experiment. Underground, in absolute darkness after Edmund extinguished the lamps from above using the control ropes, 12 children experienced the beginning of their nightmare. The initial hours in darkness were traumatic beyond description. Some children screamed, others cried quietly. The youngest, subject 12, a 6-year-old girl named Ada, called repeatedly for her brother until her voice went hoarse. They huddled together, terrified of the absolute blackness, disoriented by the stale air and stone walls, unable to comprehend what was happening or why. Time became meaningless. With no natural light, no way to gauge hours, existence collapsed into an endless present of fear and confusion. When Edmund finally returned the next morning, though the children had no way of knowing it was morning, and opened the hatch, light flooded down like a physical force. Children who had been in total darkness for approximately 14 hours covered their eyes, crying out in pain from the sudden brightness. Edmund called down, "It is morning. You will begin your first day of training now." He lowered the lamp system using the pulleys, providing light in the chambers. Then he lowered a basket containing their breakfast, cornmeal mush, water, 12 wooden spoons. "You will eat in an orderly manner," his voice echoed down from above. "Divide the food equally among yourselves. When you have finished, place the empty basket and spoons in the pulley system so they can be raised. You have 30 minutes. The children were too hungry and disoriented to do anything but obey. They ate quickly, messily, some fighting over portions until the older children established order. When finished, they returned the basket as instructed. Edmund raised it, examined the empty bowls, and made notes in his journal about cooperation levels during resource distribution and evidence of social hierarchy formation. Then he began the day's protocol. Through the speaking tube that connected his observation station to the main chamber, a design element the children hadn't yet identified, Edmund's voice emerged from the walls, disembodied and omnipresent. "You will now begin educational instruction," the voice said. "On the shelves in the main chamber you will find books. The oldest children will read aloud while others listen. You will begin with the volume titled Moral Lessons for Youth. Open it to page 1 and begin reading. I will be listening." The children looked around, trying to identify where the voice originated. Subject 1, Marcus, the 10-year-old boy, eventually located the books and began reading in a shaking voice. This established the pattern. Edmund controlled everything from above. Light, food, water, activities. The children had no autonomy, no privacy, no control over any aspect of their existence. They could not even see their captor. He remained hidden in the observation station or the root cellar above, a disembodied authority. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. Children who had been relatively well-adjusted in the dormitory began showing signs of trauma, withdrawal, aggression, dissociation. The younger ones cried frequently. The older ones tried to maintain order and calm the younger, but they were themselves terrified. By the third day, Subject 5, an 8-year-old boy named Joseph, began refusing to eat. He sat motionless on his sleeping pallet, unresponsive to the other children's attempts to rouse him. Edmund documented this as Subject 5 displaying resistance behaviors, apparent attempt to assert autonomy through food refusal. Edmund's response was calculated. He addressed the group through the speaking tube. Subject 5 has chosen not to eat. This is his choice. However, his food ration will not be redistributed to others. It will be removed. When Subject 5 decides to comply with feeding protocols, he may inform the group and regular rations will resume. Until then, all subjects will receive reduced portions due to Subject 5's non-compliance. This was deliberate psychological manipulation, turning the group against the resistant individual by making everyone suffer for one person's defiance. By the fourth day, the other children were begging Joseph to eat. By the fifth day, Joseph, weakened and pressured by peers, began eating again. Edmund documented this as a successful application of group dynamics leverage to reinforce individual compliance. By the end of the first week, the children had learned the fundamental lesson Edmund wanted to instill: absolute powerlessness. They could not leave. They could not refuse. They could not even see the person controlling their existence. All they could do was obey and hope that obedience might eventually lead to release. It wouldn't. Edmund established a rigid routine that he maintained with mechanical precision. Every day followed the same pattern. Dawn, though the children had no way to know when dawn occurred, they simply knew when Edmund decided to wake them. The hatch would open slightly, Edmund would call down, "Morning begins," and light would be provided via the lamp system. Breakfast, delivered via pulley, typically cornmeal mush or porridge, occasionally with molasses. Water, always exactly enough for survival, but never satisfaction. Morning education period, 2 hours of reading from Edmund's selected texts. Books emphasizing religious obedience, acceptance of hierarchy, the virtue of uncomplaining labor. Edmund would listen from the observation station, occasionally interrupting through the speaking tube to ask questions or correct responses. Physical exercise. Edmund required daily calisthenics, jumping, stretching, running in place. He observed through the observation slits, timing them with a pocket watch, documenting who tired quickly, who maintained stamina. This wasn't for their health. It was data collection. Midday meal. More substantial than breakfast, but still minimal. Beans, occasionally salt pork, cornbread, water. Afternoon skills training. Edmund would assign tasks, sorting objects he lowered in baskets, performing specific movements in sequence, solving simple problems. He framed these as training exercises, but they were actually psychological conditioning experiments, testing obedience, fine motor control under stress, and cognitive function in adverse conditions. Evening education. More reading, or Edmund would lecture through the speaking tube about proper behavior, the importance of fulfilling one's role, and pseudoscientific theories about human development. Evening meal, similar to breakfast, minimal rations. Darkness. At Edmund's determination of evening, lights would be extinguished. The children would be left in total blackness until the next morning. This routine continued day after day, week after week. The monotony itself was part of the horror, existence reduced to a repetitive cycle controlled entirely by an unseen master. But worse than the routine were Edmund's experimental variations, deliberate changes introduced to observe psychological effects. Some days, Edmund would leave them in darkness beyond the usual time, extending nighttime to 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours, documenting how extended sensory deprivation affected their behavior. Some days, he would wake them multiple times during the night cycle, disrupting sleep, observing effects of fatigue on compliance and cognitive function. Some days, he would reduce food portions to assess minimum nutritional thresholds required to maintain basic function. Some days, he would introduce social stressors, giving more food to some children than others, and observing resulting conflicts, or requiring children to compete for resources. He documented everything in his journals with clinical detachment. Day 23. Reduced Subject 3's rations to observe peer response. Subjects 6 and 7 shared portions of their own meals, evidence of persistent social bonding that may require additional isolation protocols to suppress. Day 31, extended darkness period to 16 hours. Subjects exhibited increased anxiety behaviors upon light restoration, elevated voice levels, repetitive questioning about time passage, physical agitation, interesting data regarding temporal disorientation effects. Day 47, introduced competitive resource distribution. Assigned food parcels by number, making allotment unequal. Subjects initially cooperative, attempting to redistribute equally. Repeated protocol daily. By day 4 of competition protocol, social cohesion breaking down, strongest subjects claiming larger portions, weaker subjects accepting subordinate positions, hierarchy solidifying as predicted. Edmund's journals from this period show a man who had completely detached from human empathy. He described children's suffering with the same tone he used to describe soil chemistry or crop yields. Human beings, especially children, possess remarkable capacity for psychological adaptation to even horrific circumstances. The 12 children underground began developing coping mechanisms, social structures, and survival strategies. Subject 1, Marcus, age 10, emerged as the informal leader. He was oldest, relatively strong, and possessed natural authority. He attempted to maintain order, mediate disputes, and enforce the routines Edmund required. He understood that chaos would likely result in worse treatment, so he became an enforcer of compliance. Subjects 2 and 4, Benjamin, age 9, and Sarah, age 9, formed a secondary leadership tier, supporting Marcus and helping manage the younger children. The younger children clustered around these older figures, seeking protection and guidance. Subject 12, 6-year-old Ada, particularly attached to Sarah, following her constantly, sleeping next to her, crying only to Sarah when the terror became too much. They developed coping rituals. When lights went out and darkness came, they would hold hands in a circle and tell stories from memory. Folk tales, Bible stories they had heard, anything to make the darkness less absolute through shared voice and touch. They assigned responsibilities to create structure. Some children managed water distribution, others maintained the sanitation area, others organized the sleeping pallets. Creating small zones of autonomy, however trivial, helped preserve sanity. They even developed resistance strategies. They learned to give Edmund the responses he wanted during his observation periods, but among themselves, they maintained their own social rules and relationships. They complied outwardly while preserving internal defiance, a subtle form of psychological survival. But adaptation came with costs. The children Edmund had taken underground in February 1856 were not the same children 6 months later. Prolonged stress, malnutrition, lack of sunlight, and psychological torture were changing them fundamentally. Physical changes were obvious. Weight loss, muscle atrophy, stunted growth, skin problems, dental issues, hair thinning. Dr. Hayes's 1862 report would document all of this. Psychological changes were deeper and more disturbing. Some children became withdrawn, speaking less, staring at walls for hours. Others developed obsessive behaviors, rocking, scratching marks into the stone walls, arranging and rearranging objects compulsively. Several started showing dissociative symptoms, seeming to leave mentally during particularly stressful periods, becoming unresponsive to stimuli. And then, children started getting sick. In early June 1856, Subject 7, Thomas, age 7, developed a fever. It began with coughing and fatigue, symptoms the other children initially dismissed as exhaustion. But within days, Thomas's condition deteriorated. His fever spiked. His breathing became labored. He developed a rattling cough that echoed through the chambers. The other children, frightened, called up through the hatch during food delivery, begging Edmund to help Thomas. Edmund, observing through the slits, noted Thomas's symptoms and lowered medicine. Willow bark tea for fever, a tonic of his own mixture. But he did not bring Thomas above ground. He did not summon Dr. Pierce. He simply provided basic remedies and continued his observations. Thomas had pneumonia, almost certainly, a bacterial infection exacerbated by the damp underground environment, poor ventilation, and weakened immune system from malnutrition. With proper medical care, he might have survived. Without it, he had little chance. The other children tried to care for him. They kept him comfortable, gave him extra water from their own rations, took turns sitting with him when he seemed frightened. Subject 2, Benjamin, stayed with Thomas almost constantly, holding his hand, telling him stories. Thomas died on June 18, 1856, in the early morning hours. Benjamin, who was with him, called up to Edmund when the hatch opened for morning protocol. "Thomas is dead, sir." He stopped breathing. Edmund's response, documented in his journal, was chillingly clinical. Subject 7 expired at approximately 06:30 hours. Cause of death likely pneumonia, with complications from environmental factors. Will remove body during evening cycle to minimize psychological impact on remaining subjects. That evening, Edmund descended into the chambers for the first time since the initial day. He carried Thomas's body up the ladder while the 11 surviving children watched in horror and grief. He provided no comfort, no acknowledgement of their loss, no explanation. He simply removed the body, closed the hatch, and buried Thomas in an unmarked grave in the woods far from the main plantation buildings. To the 11 children below, Thomas had simply vanished. Edmund told them only that Thomas had been transferred to another location for medical care, but they knew he was lying. They had seen Thomas die. They had watched Edmund carry away his body. They understood with horrifying clarity that they, too, might die underground and disappear without acknowledgement or burial. The psychological impact of Thomas's death was profound. The children's fragile hope that Edmund might eventually release them if they obeyed was shattered. They understood now that compliance might not save them. They were not in a training program that would eventually end. They were in a tomb. After Thomas's death, Edmund's journal entries begin showing signs of severe psychological deterioration. His handwriting becomes less neat. His normally precise documentation grows erratic. He misses days without entries, then writes multiple pages in frantic succession. The tone shifts from clinical detachment to defensive justification. June 20th, 1856, Subject 7's death represents an unfortunate but predictable outcome of inadequate immune response to environmental pathogens. This does not invalidate the methodology. Medical complications are variables in any biological research. Adjusting protocols to account for health maintenance requirements. June 25th, 1856. The remaining subjects display grief responses that are disrupting behavioral patterns. This is problematic. Must consider whether emotional bonds between subjects represent confounding variables that should have been eliminated through complete individual isolation from the outset. Preliminary hypothesis suggested group environment would produce useful social hierarchy data, but effective bonds may be introducing too much variability. July 3rd, 1856. Observation sessions growing increasingly difficult. The subjects stare at the observation slits when they hear movement. They know someone watches. This awareness may be affecting natural behavioral expression. Consider redesigning observation protocols to eliminate subject awareness. Edmund was beginning to recognize that his experiment was failing to produce meaningful data. 6 months of meticulous documentation had revealed nothing of scientific value. Only the obvious fact that children suffer when imprisoned underground in horrific conditions. But he couldn't admit failure. To do so would require acknowledging what he had become. So instead, he began reframing the experiment in his mind, adjusting his hypothesis, convincing himself that the lack of useful results was due to methodological problems rather than fundamental moral atrocity. He reduced his direct interactions with the children to absolute minimum. Where he had previously conducted education sessions and social conditioning exercises, he now simply maintained basic life support, delivering food and water, maintaining light cycles, removing waste via the pulley system when the smell became intolerable enough to reach the root cellar above. He spent more time analyzing his accumulated journals, searching for patterns that would validate his work. He found nothing. The data was just descriptions of suffering. He began drinking heavily, something he had rarely done previously. Neighbors noticed his deteriorating appearance, his withdrawal from social obligations. Some attributed this to prolonged mourning for Louisa. Others whispered that Edmund had always been strange and was now becoming overtly unstable. No one guessed the truth. In September 1856, Subject 9, Ruth, age 8, injured herself. She fell while climbing on the storage shelves. The children sometimes climbed as a form of exercise and play in their confined space, and cut her leg on a sharp edge of broken pottery. The wound wasn't initially severe, a deep gash that bled heavily but could have healed with proper treatment. The children called up to Edmund when he delivered the next meal, showing him Ruth's bloody leg. Edmund lowered bandages and a bottle of alcohol for cleaning the wound. But in the damp, unsanitary underground environment, with no proper medical supplies and no way to keep the wound clean, infection was almost inevitable. Within days, Ruth's leg was swollen and discolored. She developed a fever. The infection spread. By September 3rd, she was delirious. By September 4th, she was dead. Edmund's journal entry. Subject 9 expired due to infection from traumatic injury. Septicemia, likely cause of death. Note: environment presents ongoing health risks that may require additional mitigation protocols or experiment duration reduction. Experiment duration reduction was the first time Edmund had written anything suggesting he might consider ending what he had started. But this was only abstract consideration, not genuine intention. He took no action. Once again, Edmund removed a body under cover of darkness. Once again, the children watched in helpless horror as one of their number disappeared. 10 remained. The next year, from autumn 1856 through 1857, passed in grinding monotony punctuated by moments of acute suffering. Edmund maintained the basic protocols but with decreasing engagement. His journal entries became sparse. October 1856, protocols continue, subjects compliant, no significant incidents. December 1856, adjusted rations due to increased food costs, subjects adapting. February 1857, 1 year since protocol initiation, health status declining across all subjects, persistent minor ailments. Growth rates significantly below expected norms for age ranges. Psychological conditions varied, several subjects showing marked behavioral changes. The children underground were entering a state of profound trauma. The constant darkness cycles, malnutrition, lack of any normal childhood development opportunities, these were inflicting damage that could never be fully healed. Some began showing signs of what would later be recognized as severe depression, lying motionless for hours, refusing to interact, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Others developed anxiety disorders, constant hypervigilance, startled responses to any sound, panic when lights went out. Subject 12, Ada, now 7 years old, stopped speaking entirely. She communicated only through gestures and sounds. Subject 8, Dinah, the girl whose family Edmund had deliberately sold away, developed obsessive rituals, repeatedly washing her hands in the limited water they had, counting objects over and over, arranging stones in precise patterns. Edmund documented these behaviors clinically, but without understanding their meaning. He didn't recognize these as symptoms of severe psychological trauma because he didn't view the children as fully human. They were subjects. Their suffering was data. Meanwhile, above ground, the plantation continued operating. Enslaved workers tended fields, maintained buildings, produced crops. Life proceeded normally for everyone except the 10 children in darkness. Some of the enslaved adults on the property suspected something. They noticed that 12 children had vanished. They noticed Edmund's increasing instability. They heard sounds, faint, carried through the ventilation shafts on quiet nights, that might have been voices from underground. But what could they do? Speaking openly would risk punishment. They had no legal authority. Even if they reported concerns to white authorities, who would believe enslaved people accusing a respected white plantation owner of wrongdoing? So they watched, worried, and remained silent. trapped by the same system that allowed Edmund to imprison children underground without consequence. As 1857 turned to 1858 and 1858 to 1859, Edmund's engagement with his experiment decreased further. He had long since stopped pretending it was producing useful results. The journals that had once contained detailed observations now held only sparse maintenance notes, but he couldn't stop. Stopping would require deciding what to do with the 10 children below, and every option was impossible. Release them. They would talk about what had happened. Even if others didn't believe enslaved children, enough rumors would spread to destroy Edmund's reputation and potentially trigger investigation. Sell them. Their physical and psychological condition would raise immediate questions about their treatment. No buyer would accept them without demanding explanations. Kill them. Edmund had reached the point of profound moral depravity, but he still retained enough self-awareness to recognize that directly murdering 10 children would make him what he refused to consciously acknowledge: a monster. So he did nothing. The children remained underground, existing in a state between life and death, while Edmund maintained minimal life support and avoided confronting the enormity of his crimes. Then history intervened. Political tensions between North and South, building for decades, finally erupted. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. Tennessee followed in June 1861. The Civil War began, and Edmund Harwell, facing a changing world where federal armies might seize his property and discover his secrets, had to make a final decision about the 10 children in darkness. By autumn 1861, federal forces were advancing into Tennessee. Nashville would fall to Union control in February 1862. Edmund, a known Confederate sympathizer, understood that his property might be seized, occupied, searched. He began making arrangements to flee, selling some assets, packing valuables, preparing to relocate to Confederate-held territory further south. But the children presented an impossible problem. He couldn't take them. He couldn't release them. He couldn't remain at the estate to maintain them. His final journal entry, dated November 15, 1861, reads, "The subjects below represent a complication that cannot accompany relocation. The most practical solution requires decisive action that I find myself unable to." The entry stops mid-sentence. The rest of the page is blank. Edmund apparently couldn't even write what he was considering. Evidence suggests he made a final descent to the underground chambers sometime in mid-November 1861. He lowered a large quantity of supplies, enough food and water, theoretically, for several months. He may have intended this as a way to defer his decision, to provide basic survival resources and then simply flee, letting fate determine the outcome. Or he may have provided supplies, knowing they would eventually run out, knowing the children would die slowly of starvation in darkness, but telling himself he hadn't directly killed them. We don't know his reasoning, because he never wrote it down. Sometime in late November 1861, Edmund Harwell departed his estate. He secured the hatch bolt, he left the manor largely intact, and he vanished. The 10 children below were abandoned in absolute darkness, with limited supplies, no way to escape, and no knowledge of whether anyone would ever return. When Private Ketchum opened that hatch on February 19, 1862, the children had been underground for 5 years and 11 months. 2 more had died in the months since Edmund's abandonment. The supplies Edmund had left ran out in late January 1862. The children had been without food for approximately 3 weeks when federal soldiers found them. They had survived by drinking condensed moisture from the stone walls and by sheer resilience. Dr. Hayes's medical examination, conducted over several days, documented conditions that shocked even hardened military personnel. Physical condition. All 8 survivors showed severe malnutrition, with body weights 50–60% below expected norms. Their growth had been dramatically stunted. Children who should have been in early adolescence appeared years younger. They had rickets from vitamin D deficiency, causing bone deformities. Their skin was pallid, almost translucent from years without sunlight. Many had infections, untreated injuries, dental decay, and respiratory problems. Psychological condition. This was perhaps even more disturbing than physical damage. Several children were initially mute, unable or unwilling to speak. They flinched from light, covered their eyes, showed extreme distress in open spaces. They exhibited what Dr. Hayes described as complete institutional adaptation to captivity. They expected to be told when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak. Freedom terrified them because they no longer understood how to exist without absolute external control. 2 were catatonic for the first several days after rescue, staring blankly, unresponsive to questions or comfort. 1 engaged in repetitive self-harm behaviors, hitting his head against walls, biting his own arms. Another could not tolerate being alone, panicking if separated from the other rescued children even briefly. Dr. Hayes concluded his report with unusual emotion for a military medical document. I have witnessed casualties of war, victims of violence, suffering of many varieties. But I have never encountered trauma of this profound and systematic nature. These children have been subjected to conditions that exceed conventional categories of cruelty. The damage inflicted, physical, psychological, developmental, may prove irreversible. Whoever perpetrated this act has committed evil of a magnitude that challenges comprehension and demands justice. But justice would not come. Captain Morrison forwarded his investigation findings to his commanding officer in Nashville. The report then moved up the military chain of command. At each level, officers read the evidence with shock and horror. And at each level, political considerations intervened. The Union Army in Tennessee was managing a complex situation. They controlled territory but not hearts and minds. They needed cooperation from local populations, or at least passive compliance. They were trying to demonstrate that federal occupation would be orderly and just. The story of Edmund Harwell was politically problematic for multiple reasons. Racial politics. The victims were enslaved children. While this made Edmund's crime particularly heinous, it also made prosecution complicated. Enslaved people were legally property. Tennessee law at the time provided minimal protection for them. Prosecuting a white plantation owner for crimes against his property, even crimes this extreme, had little legal precedent. Confederate sympathy. Much of Tennessee's population sympathized with the Confederacy. Edmund was a known Confederate supporter who had fled federal occupation. Making him a cause célèbre through prosecution would create a martyr narrative, potentially inflaming anti-Union sentiment. Military priorities. The Army was fighting a war. Resources and attention were focused on military objectives, not on complex criminal investigations of individuals who had already fled. Victim testimony. The 8 surviving children were severely traumatized. Even if authorities wanted to prosecute based on their testimony, their psychological condition made them problematic witnesses. Defense attorneys would easily challenge their credibility. So federal authorities made a decision. The investigation would be quietly closed. The detailed reports would be sealed. Officers involved would be instructed not to discuss the case publicly. The official file would note only irregularities in plantation management before being archived and forgotten. The 8 children were moved to a contraband camp, one of many facilities established for formerly enslaved people liberated by Union forces. There they joined thousands of other displaced persons, their individual stories lost in the chaos of war. Edmund Harwell was not pursued. No charges were filed. His name appeared on no wanted lists. He had committed perhaps one of the most horrific crimes in a region and era filled with horrific crimes, and he would face no legal consequences. What happened to the 8 survivors after their rescue is largely unknown. Military records from contraband camps were poorly maintained. Many people passed through these facilities without being documented. Families were separated. Children were orphaned or lost. Names were changed or misspelled. The 8 children from the Harwell estate, Subject 1 through Subject 12, minus the 4 who died, disappeared into history. We have only fragments. A brief mention in a Union Army chaplain's diary from March 1862 describes working with traumatized children rescued from cave imprisonment, attempting to provide spiritual comfort, though they seem unreachable, lost in darkness even in daylight. A note in a Freedmen's Bureau report from 1865 mentions a group of young people with unusual psychological conditions, claiming to have been held underground for years during slavery, likely trauma-induced false memories or exaggerated accounts of typical plantation confinement. And that 1883 newspaper interview with Mrs. E.H., who told a story about being held underground that the interviewer dismissed as fanciful. Whether any of the 8 survived the war, found families, built lives beyond their trauma, we don't know. Their names weren't recorded. Their testimonies weren't preserved. They were erased from history as thoroughly as Edmund had tried to erase them from the world. Edmund Harwell's fate is similarly uncertain. Confederate records were incomplete and often destroyed. Tracking individuals through the chaos of war was difficult. Some unconfirmed reports and circumstantial evidence suggest he may have reached Atlanta in early 1862, where he possibly worked as a clerk in the Confederate Commissary Department. A personnel roster from March 1862 lists an E. Harwell in that office, but without additional identifying information. A death certificate filed in Richmond, Virginia, in August 1863 records the death of Edmund Harwell, age 49, died of typhoid fever at a military hospital. The description matches Edmund's age and origin, but confirmation is impossible. An alternative account, recorded in an unpublished memoir by a Confederate veteran, mentions encountering a man named Harwell in South Carolina in 1864. A strange and broken fellow who spoke little and seemed haunted by private demons. This man allegedly died by suicide in late 1864, though no official record confirms this. We don't know if Edmund Harwell died in 1863, 1864, or survived the war and lived for years afterward under a different name. We don't know if he ever felt remorse or remained delusional about his research until death. We don't know if he suffered or died peacefully. We know only that he committed an atrocity, escaped justice, and vanished. For decades, almost all physical evidence of Edmund's crimes was lost or destroyed. His journals documenting the experiment disappeared. Federal investigators presumably seized them in 1862, but they're not in National Archives collections where they should be. They were either deliberately destroyed, lost in administrative chaos, or hidden in private collections. The underground chambers were deliberately collapsed in the 1880s. Someone, possibly a property owner who learned what had happened there, or possibly federal authorities returning to erase evidence, filled the chambers with rubble and dynamited the access shafts. Official investigation reports were sealed and, over time, most were lost. Only fragments survived. In 1934, a historian named Robert Kimball, researching Civil War contraband camps, found a partial copy of Dr. Hayes's 1862 medical report, misfiled in a Nashville archive. The document was incomplete, missing the first several pages, but the surviving sections contained detailed descriptions of the 8 survivors' physical and psychological conditions. Kimball was shocked. He began investigating, searching for additional information about what he called the Harwell case. He found almost nothing, a few marginal references in military correspondence, one brief mention in a chaplain's diary, no trial records because there had been no trial. He wrote a 20-page academic paper titled An Undocumented Atrocity, the Harwell Plantation Incident of 1862. He submitted it to the Journal of Southern History. It was rejected as insufficiently documented and sensationalistic. He submitted to 2 other journals. Both rejected it. He finally published in an obscure regional history quarterly in 1937. The paper attracted almost no attention. 3 copies exist today in university library archives. Kimball died in 1941, his research unfinished and largely ignored. The partial medical report he found was lost again during an archive reorganization in the 1950s. Its current location is unknown. The Harwell estate itself changed hands repeatedly after the war. Federal authorities seized it in 1862, using it for military purposes until 1865. It was sold at auction in 1867 to a carpetbagger from Ohio who tried unsuccessfully to farm it. That owner sold it in 1873 to a local farmer who grew tobacco for 6 years. The manor house burned down in June 1879 in a fire of suspicious origin. Arson was suspected but never proven. Some locals whispered that it was deliberately destroyed by people who knew what had happened there and wanted the site cleansed. The property was subdivided in 1885 and sold to 3 different buyers. By 1900, it had been divided again into smaller parcels. The early 20th century brought urbanization. Nashville expanded. The area that had been the Harwell Plantation gradually became suburb, then city neighborhood. Today, the location is part of Davidson County's southeastern urban area. A shopping center occupies part of the original estate. A residential subdivision called Meadowbrook covers another portion. A commercial district with offices and restaurants stands where the manor house once stood. Tens of thousands of people pass through this area daily. They shop, work, live, completely unaware that beneath the pavement and buildings lie the filled and collapsed chambers where children suffered in darkness. No historical marker commemorates what happened there. No memorial names the victims. Most people who live and work in the area have no idea of the history beneath their feet. The land itself remembers nothing. The stones that witnessed horror are buried under layers of rubble, concrete, and ordinary American life. This story concludes not with resolution, but with uncomfortable questions. Edmund Harwell committed an almost unthinkable crime. He imprisoned 12 children underground for years, subjected them to prolonged torture under the guise of scientific research, and directly caused the deaths of 4, arguably 6, if we count the 2 who died after his abandonment as consequences of his actions. And he faced no justice, no trial, no punishment, no public accounting. The 8 children who survived suffered damage that likely marked them for life. They received no compensation, no recognition of their suffering, no acknowledgement in history. Their names are lost. Their stories are forgotten. They existed, suffered, perhaps survived into adulthood or perhaps died young, and history doesn't remember them. This erasure was deliberate. Federal authorities suppressed information because it was politically inconvenient. Records were sealed, destroyed, lost. Witnesses were silenced. The crime was buried as thoroughly as the underground chambers, and so we're left with fragments, pieces of testimony, partial documents, second-hand accounts, that together suggest something horrific, but can never be fully confirmed. The story of the Harwell Plantation exists in that uncomfortable space between documented fact and lost history. We know children disappeared. We know underground chambers existed. We know federal soldiers discovered something in February 1862 that deeply disturbed them. We know reports were written and then suppressed. But we don't know names. We don't know faces. We don't know who survived and who didn't. We don't know whether any of the victims lived long enough to tell their story in their own words, or whether they all died with their testimony unheard. This uncertainty is itself an injustice, perhaps the final injustice in a cascade of injustices that began when Edmund Harwell first conceived his experiment. The children who suffered at his hands deserved justice. They deserved to have their suffering acknowledged, their names remembered, their story told. They deserved to have the man who tortured them prosecuted and punished. They received none of this, and so their story remains what it has always been. A half-remembered horror, a fragmentary truth, a historical crime that justice never addressed and memory barely preserved. Somewhere in Nashville, Tennessee, beneath shopping carts and parking lots and ordinary American life, the stones that witnessed their nightmare still remain, buried and silent. 12 children entered darkness in February 1856, 10 emerged in February 1862, 8 survived. And history forgot them all.